In 1991, a team of scientists pointed seismic sensors toward the base of the Great Sphinx, expecting solid stone. What they found instead defied everything they knew. Deep beneath the ancient monument, their instruments detected rectangular voids, symmetrical, deliberate, carved with purpose. Not cracks, not faults, but chambers. The data was unmistakable. Beneath the Sphinx lay something hollow, something geometric, as if an architect from another age had hidden it there. But the discovery wasn't entirely new. Someone had spoken of it before. 60 years earlier, a man named Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, described a secret vault buried beneath the Sphinx, a place he called the Hall of Records. According to him, it was built by survivors of a lost world, a civilization swallowed by the sea, to preserve the truth of humanity's first dawn. Now, the scientist's findings matched his words almost exactly. The coordinates, the depth, the placement. For skeptics, it was pure coincidence. For others, it was something far greater, the first real crack between myth and history, a whisper that the past might be hiding far more than we ever imagined. For others, it was the first crack in the story of human history itself. But first, before we explore those ancient hidden chambers, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, let's get back to tonight's story. In the early 1930s, a quiet man in a modest house in Virginia closed his eyes, fell into a trance, and began speaking about a chamber lost beneath the Sphinx. His voice, recorded by typists who worked by lamplight, described a vault positioned below its forepaws, built long before Egypt's dynasties. He gave coordinates specific enough to be mapped decades before technology could peer beneath that stone body. To those around him, it sounded like an echo from another age, one part prophecy, one part blueprint. The man was Edgar Cayce, known by his followers as the Sleeping Prophet. He never claimed to be awake when his revelations arrived. Instead, he drifted into altered states, half sleeping, half speaking, while his words spilled through him like dictation from somewhere beyond his memory. He would talk of lost continents, of floods and migrations, of civilizations that once could harness energies forgotten by modern science. But among all the predictions that passed through him, one kept returning with precision. Beneath the Sphinx's right paw, he said, lies a hall of records, containing the story of humanity's true beginning, traced back to the yet small desks, converting his murmured syllables into careful handwriting. Each reading carried fragments of the same geography, coordinates, angles, the mention of entrances guarded by silence and sand. One stenographer later described how her hands trembled as she wrote, not from belief, but from the eerie certainty in Cayce's tone. The man spoke like someone who had been there before. On a map tacked above the desk, they drew the Sphinx's outline and shaded the ground between its paws, labeling it simply with a question mark. For Cayce's followers, the Hall of Records was no mere tomb. It was an archive of memory, documenting an epoch when knowledge and myth were not separate. He claimed that after the fall of Atlantis, around 12,000 years ago, its survivors established colonies where the Nile meets the desert, rebuilding fragments of their lost science. The massive, lion-headed sentinel in his account marked the threshold to their subterranean library, sealed until humanity was ready once again to use its wisdom. His words carried an odd mixture of fatalism and optimism. He seemed certain that rediscovery of these records would signal both remembrance and reckoning. Critics, even in his lifetime, dismissed these readings as mystical invention. A psychic predicting coordinates beneath one of the world's most studied monuments sounded like folklore with footnotes. Archaeologists regarded his claims as fringe spirituality wrapped in pseudogeography. Yet, among his stenographers and archivists, small curiosities persisted. Why the Sphinx? Why that exact spot? And how had a man with no formal training in geology or Egyptian history pinpointed a location that would, decades later, draw the attention of scientists armed with seismic equipment? By the mid-20th century, the archive of his readings, thousands of pages stored by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, or R, became both a curiosity and a seed for future expeditions. Cayce himself had said the chamber would be found in the 1990s, a detail that would age from prophecy to coincidence soon enough. When those years arrived, researchers did indeed sweep ground sensors beneath the Sphinx's forepaws, chasing anomalies that rose from below the sand like faint heartbeats. Most regarded it as a fascinating alignment of storytelling and science, an old prophecy meeting a modern instrument's hum. Inside Cayce's small office, the late-night rituals continued even after his death in 1945. Assistants turned his predictions into index cards stored alphabetically: Atlantis, Egypt, prophecies, Sphinx. They annotated weathered anecdotes about world floods, keeping one eye on his more specific data descriptions. During those years, popular fascination with lost civilizations grew rapidly. Articles about Babylonia, Lemuria, and pyramid power exploded across radio and magazines, blending new technology with ancient awe. The Sphinx, motionless but ever watchful, became the quiet icon of that movement. The description Cayce offered of its age clashed directly with accepted Egyptology. He dated it to around 10,000 BC, an era archaeologists saw as prehistory, long before organized states or formal irrigation. To professionals, the claim broke both timelines and patience. Yet, in his readings, he insisted the monument was older than the pyramids by thousands of years. It was built, he said, by exiles from Atlantis who wanted to leave a signal for those who would forget. That phrasing caught people's imagination because it sounded less like grand myth and more like instruction, a relic meant to be activated one day, rather than merely admired. By the time seismic teams took interest in the early 1990s, that instruction seemed to echo in unexpected places. Geophysicist Thomas DeBecke, working with geologist Robert Schoch, directed low-frequency waves through the limestone base of the Sphinx to read density changes underground. What bounced back were clear geometric patterns, rectangular cavities beneath the forepaws. Their findings, presented publicly in 1991, noted shapes too regular to be simple cracks or voids. Though careful with language, DeBecke admitted surprise at how symmetrical the anomalies seemed. Such detail sounded faintly like the outlines Cayce had spoken of 6 decades earlier. Cayce's old foundation in Virginia Beach had supported parts of that research financially. For critics, it blurred uncomfortable borders, science entangled with faith. How objective could data be when funded by those inviting its prophecy to prove itself? Yet, others saw the partnership as poetic symmetry, like two worlds meeting halfway, one sending vibrations through stone, the other through trance. Even the scientists, privately, must have felt the strange tension between their instruments and the history that clung to their sponsors' expectations. Among mainstream Egyptologists, reaction ranged from irritation to unease. Zahi Hawass, who oversaw many excavations around the Sphinx, openly dismissed talk of secret vaults as Western fantasy. He argued that the anomalies could be natural fissures from ancient seismic activity, a mundane explanation shaped like a mystery. Still, some reports claim he authorized brief follow-up investigations, possibly to satisfy curiosity, possibly to keep control over what narrative might form if outsiders continue their search unchecked. The results of those deeper studies were never fully released, ensuring that theories only multiplied in the gaps where information thinned. For Cayce's community, though, the overlap was breathtaking. On the very spot where he'd placed his Hall of Records, the right forepaw, modern sensors located a void roughly 25 feet beneath the surface. Whether chamber, fissure, or coincidence, it was enough to reignite the century-old question: could knowledge survive in stone, waiting for its rediscovery? Supporters suggested that the Sphinx might guard a message written not in ink but in architecture. The Hall of Records, as Cayce described it, contains scrolls chronicling the history of Atlantis, its technologies, and the migrations that seeded later cultures. He envisioned humans once capable of channeling forces between the physical and the spiritual, bridging energy in ways forgotten after catastrophe. Many of his words felt half metaphor, half memory, record of that which makes one whole again. Beneath such phrasing lay a theme that appealed deeply to those alive during turbulent decades: the dream that humanity had once been wiser, more connected, and might one day reunite with that source of understanding. For Egypt's academic community, the claim threatened decades of careful chronology. The Fourth Dynasty timeline placed the Sphinx firmly within Pharaoh Khufu's reign. About 2500 BC, every temple alignment, every quarry mark supported that range. To admit any significant anomaly, even by geological happenstance, invited endless public speculation. In cafes from Cairo to London, these small details metastasized into larger debates. Could the world's most famous statue sit atop something older than its own civilization? The question refused to stay confined within scientific journals. It leapt to documentaries, talk shows, and late-night radio. Inside our headquarters, archivists watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. Some had once transcribed the coordinates themselves. The handwriting on those yellowing pages recorded latitude and placement as if they were mundane facts, never imagining they might later mirror a scientist's notation. One can picture them in the 1940s, stacks of carbon paper, lamps burning low, writing phrases that would, decades later, flicker to life on a seismic graph. The rhythm of pencil on paper, the faint hum of the typewriter return bar, layers of human persistence, recording what they could not prove. Still, the boundary between coincidence and revelation remains unsteady. Critics counter that a psychic recording vague coordinates near one of history's most excavated sites is bound to overlap with someone's future dig. Probability, not prophecy, they say, explains the pattern. Yet, as with so many ancient enigmas, numbers alone don't dissolve fascination. People sense something deliberate in how time folds these parallels together. A reading in Virginia becomes an echo in limestone. A location once whispered in trance becomes a blip on a monitor. By 1993, an NBC documentary titled The Mystery of the Sphinx carried these findings to the public. Narration blended geological observations with mythic overtones, freely weaving Cayce's predictions into the scientific storyline. Viewers were left contemplating whether this marriage of faith and frequency hinted at hidden truth or clever television. But for those already steeped in Cayce's lore, it felt like vindication, a signal rising where words once lay dormant. The Hall of Records, in mythic terms, represents more than buried architecture. It is the wish that humanity once possessed unified knowledge of nature, energy, and spirit, and then lost it through pride or catastrophe. Its symbolic power lies in the idea that physical discovery could erase spiritual amnesia. The vault under the Sphinx, whether real or imagined, turns that yearning into geography. To uncover it would mean more than finding artifacts. It would mean confronting the possibility that history moves in cycles, not straight lines. Skeptics, however, warn against reading too much into these alignments. Seismic readings detect shapes, not intention. Fissures can resemble corridors. Cavities can mimic chambers. But such caution rarely quiets public hunger for wonder. Where data leaves blanks, imagination eagerly writes. And as long as the Egyptian government restricts deeper excavation under the monument, each unanswered question takes on the shimmer of guarded truth. The mix of limitation and curiosity has kept the story balanced on a knife edge. For every academic paper closing the case, another fringe article reopens it. Even now, the coordinates traced by Cayce's stenographers overlap neatly with the published maps from the 1990 surveys, a measured congruence that neither side has fully explained away. The handwriting from the 1930s and the graphs from the 1990s sit decades apart yet harmonize on paper, as if collaborating unknowingly across time. Perhaps that's why the idea endures, not because evidence has confirmed it, but because it haunts a perfect midpoint between what we can measure and what we long to believe. Whether Cayce channeled unseen memory, subconscious pattern recognition, or pure accident, his chosen spot beneath the right forepaw continues to resist dismissal. Even Egypt's endless wind, sweeping sand into the same cracks for centuries, hasn't erased its outline from human imagination. The story of the prophet and his coordinates reveals less about supernatural knowledge and more about the texture of faith, people needing the hidden to be just plausible enough to chase. And sometimes, the harder we measure, the more those myths hum back with something like a pulse. Beneath that pulse lies the suggestion that stone still keeps secrets, not just of geology, but of time itself. And so the line between dream and data remains faint but visible. The sleeping man's words, the scientist's seismographs, and the desert's unbroken patience converge beneath one statue's gaze. The coordinates overlap exactly. The echo between them may mean nothing, or it may mean that myth has patiently left a shadow where reason one day would look. A century ago, before radar and satellites, wanderers on the Giza Plateau wrote of tunnels yawning below the Sphinx's paws, half-sealed by drifted sands. A century ago, before radar or satellites could read the ground, travelers moving across the Giza Plateau spoke of tunnels stretching beneath the Sphinx. The place was quieter then, a wide plain of cracked stone and a wind-blown grit where the desert swallowed sound as quickly as it gave it. From that stillness, they claimed to see openings between the paws, dark recesses half-sealed by drifting sand. Some said the air that rose from those gaps was cooler, smelling faintly of damp limestone. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make them linger, their torches bending in the breeze as if the earth itself might exhale a secret. Accounts from the early 19th century describe how explorers like Giovanni Battista Caviglia fought to clear the Sphinx of centuries of encroaching sand. He worked with little more than shovels, ropes, and a stubborn curiosity that kept him digging until his hands bled. His workers claimed to hit patches where the sand suddenly fell away, as though slipping into hollows. Caviglia thought he might uncover an entrance, but was forced to abandon his search when the desert began reclaiming the trenches faster than he could clear them. Those brief collapses of sand became stories whispered in salons and later copied into letters that drifted across Europe. By the mid-1800s, others followed. Explorers like Howard Weiss and John Sharp Herring brought drilling tools, seeking to find voids inside the Sphinx itself. Much of their effort focused on the statue's rear, where they made a vertical bore that found only compact rock and frustration. Yet, as reports spread, entire maps began to appear in journals and sketchbooks showing dotted lines that trailed away under the monument's pores toward the plateau's heart. The sketches looked like veins, or perhaps the memory of passageways worn down by water long gone. Even when the evidence failed to prove anything real, the image of a buried labyrinth refused to fade. Travelers from Napoleon's scientific expedition at the start of the century had recorded similar whispers. Among their papers were notations of small fissures and damp-streaked clefts at the Sphinx's base. Some of their artists drew what they believed to be door outlines under the colossal stone chest, shaded in ink so faint it seemed more suggestion than structure. None of them could confirm whether those lines led deeper, but the images circulated among antiquarians who took them as inspiration. Before long, the idea of tunnels beneath the Sphinx had become a quiet obsession, one shared in coffeehouses, libraries, and private lectures by men who fancied themselves guardians of buried truth. The fascination was not a modern one. Long before Europeans arrived with notebooks and spades, Herodotus had written of a labyrinth said to lie beneath Giza, an underworld of chambers that mirrored the heavens. Later chroniclers like Iamblichus added fragments to the tale, writing of galleries leading from the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid. Still others insisted these corridors sheltered scrolls and star charts from earlier ages. To the ancient mind, the desert was not absence but concealment, preserved rather than erased. So even as centuries passed, the conviction that something intentional lay below the Sphinx never entirely died. A Roman account by Pliny the Elder repeated local beliefs that the monument was hollow, perhaps holding a tomb. Later, Islamic writers described secret chambers cut deep into the limestone, linked by flooded shafts. Those claims folded into the background of superstition that surrounded the place. When European explorers began rediscovering Egypt's ruins, they did so under the influence of those older texts, using myth almost as a guidebook. Each new sketch or excavation promised to align rumor with evidence, though the two rarely met cleanly. The work of Carvelia, Mariette, and eventually Maspero in the 19th century turned excavation into spectacle. Teams toiled in the heat, clearing tons of sand from around the colossal head and shoulders. They climbed scaffolding and descended into narrow pits, their lamps leaving soot against the walls. One account describes a worker pressing his ear to the stone and hearing an echo when his companions struck the surface farther off. It might have been chance acoustics, yet rumors quickly spread of corridors hidden beneath the pores. When Mariette later reported that portions of the bedrock rang hollow, the suggestion clung to his name even after he dismissed it in official correspondence. Conditions around the Sphinx were brutal. Sandstorms returned overnight, erasing entire weeks of labor. Workers complained that the air inside the trenches smelled of wet chalk and rot, a sign that moisture was trapped somewhere within the rock. Many believed they were opening ground untouched since the monument's creation. At dusk, when the light turned copper red, the shadows stretched across the body of the Sphinx like bands on a sleeping cat. The men spoke softly, aware that every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. In that atmosphere, it was easy for empty fissures to become imagined thresholds. As the 19th century unfolded, maps of Giza began to include dotted zones labeled unverified chamber or possible passage. Each new cartographer copied elements from the last, and so the myth gained contour through repetition. Even so, official archives grew quieter. Archaeology shifted focus toward chronology, dating the dynasties, cataloging artifacts, classifying tombs, while stories of tunnels were quietly left out of professional papers. By the time photography replaced sketchwork, few admitted to believing in secret caverns. Yet local guides, repeating what they had heard for generations, continued to point toward the Sphinx's paws and say, "There is a door." The French engineers rumored to have found such a doorway in the 1830s only deepened the intrigue. Their names flicker between travel diaries like ghosts. Some accounts claim they were ordered to seal what they found and keep it quiet for reasons of security or fear of collapse. No report survives to confirm it, but disappearance can itself become evidence in the language of mystery. People filled in the blanks, as they always do, imagining a chamber too dangerous or too sacred to expose. The absence of data only made the story stronger. Mariette's later attempts to drain and clear the base brought progress, but not resolution. He discovered fragments of what might have been ancient retaining walls, suggesting that the Sphinx lay in a quarry later, converted into a sacred enclosure. If true, that meant hollow spaces were likely cut as working tunnels or tool pits long before the sculpture took form. Yet that practical explanation never captured public imagination. It is less thrilling to think of storage corridors than libraries from Atlantis, so when those excavations ended in silence, popular fascination began to outgrow scientific caution. Meanwhile, in Europe, the notion of underground archives found fertile ground among spiritualists. They borrowed from Cayce's later prophecies, but drew inspiration from earlier travelers who hinted at hidden repositories. By blending the old chronicles with fresh whispers, they built a composite legend, the idea of a hall of records resting under the lion's body, containing knowledge from a time before Egypt. That belief, though speculative, circulated through magazines and fringe societies. If the Sphinx had guarded wisdom once, perhaps it still did. People wanted that mystery to outlive verification. Through these years of excavation and rumor, the human texture of the story remains the same: men lowering oil lamps into cracks, hieroglyph-covered shards pulled from damp hollows, the scrape of metal tools meeting unexpected air. You can almost hear the low chatter of diggers debating whether the hollow was natural or built. Their doubts preserved in field notes and half-buried reports feel more tangible than any myth. They remind us that every discovery, even a mistaken one, begins with patience in front of stubborn stone. Official archaeology grew more guarded in the early 20th century. Under colonial administrations and later independent Egypt, the emphasis became control and conservation. Permissions tightened. Unauthorized digging around the Sphinx was forbidden, forcing unverified claims to live on through rumor. Yet those limits also created a vacuum that speculation eagerly filled. When scientists could no longer probe freely, mystics filled the silence. The result was a narrative running parallel to documented history, one built on anticipation, where belief expanded to fill every gap the evidence left uncharted. Even today, some of those early sketches are stored quietly in European archives, dust-heavy pages showing faint outlines of something below the pores. Whether those lines depict shadow or space is impossible to say. What matters is their persistence. Every generation seems to redraw them, translating the same hope into new technology. For the wanderers of the 19th century, it was a shovel and torch. For later researchers, it would be seismic sensors and computer maps. The question, however, remained unchanged. What does the Sphinx hide beneath its immutable face? That continuity gives the myth a kind of heartbeat. From Greek historians to French engineers, from Bedouin guides to modern geologists, each group has contributed a layer. The patterns repeat: discovery, suppression, rediscovery. Some saw sealed doorways, others only cracks. Between those extremes lies a long stretch of possibility, the space where legend anchors reality. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Because no one, not even the most precise instrument, has yet erased the faint promise that something might wait below. As the years passed, the idea of those ancient tunnels began to converge with developing science. The same coordinates once mapped by torchlight would later be revisited by technologists armed with seismic probes. Their instruments spoke in pulses instead of echoes, but the curiosity was identical. Each reading sought to replace rumor with resonance, to find in numbers what explorers once sought in shadow. It was a continuation rather than a correction, one story layering quietly over another in the same sand. When the 20th century finally brought machines capable of looking below without digging, the myth gained a new kind of audience. People began comparing those early sketches to modern data, noting coincidences between the suspected hollows and later anomalies. Whether meaningful or not, the overlap gave weight to whispers once dismissed. In this sense, the 19th century adventurers did more than speculate. They charted a direction for inquiry long before the technology existed to confirm or deny it. Their maps became the rough outlines of a prophecy waiting for proof. The explorers didn't know that a century later, researchers with ground-penetrating devices would target nearly the same points and find, to their surprise, readings that refused to behave like solid stone. Even now, scholars debate whether those old accounts were accidents of erosion or intuition sharpened by chance. But something lingers in the record, the impression that both myth and a measurement trace the same hidden route. The Sphinx, patient as ever, offers no clarification. Its paws rest on the same ground those wanderers once tore into, and the sealed spaces, if they exist, have kept their appointment with secrecy. Yet there's a symmetry in that. The earliest glimpses through the sand, the smell of damp rock rising, the echo beneath a worker's feet, all these fragments form the outline of a mystery that still refuses to fade. Those first narrow passages, half seen and quickly lost, were the beginning of a map written in story. That map, drawn by hand and revised in dreams, would later align with readings from machines that never touched the stone. Through coincidence or design, the coordinates matched, and so the myth of the Sphinx's hidden chambers didn't vanish. Prepared the way for science to rediscover wonder. The old torchlight, it seems, had already marked where the seismograph would one day listen. In 1991, the desert shook softly with soundless pulses, low waves rippling through stone, too gentle to disturb a single grain of sand. The Great Sphinx stood unmoved, its eyes half eroded and ancient as weather itself. Around its paws, cables snaked towards small metal boxes that fed into headsets and glowing dials. The air shimmered with heat, though beneath it ran another current, one that didn't belong to wind or sun, but to a pulse stitched deep in the bedrock. Inside a steel vent stationed nearby, a technician rested his headphones over one ear and waited for the next echo to arrive. It came not as a bang or a rumble, but as a faint change in tone. He marked a notch on clear acetate film, tracing peaks that rose like the corners of a buried door. The frequency slipped through a narrow band of limestone and returned slightly delayed, just enough to say something hollow might be there. Each mark became a coordinate, each wave a possible outline. In the dim light, his pen hesitated as another line flattened unexpectedly, forming a perfect rectangle beneath the Sphinx's forepaws. Too neat to be a crack, too isolated to be random layering. He wrote a note beside it, small and undecided. Cavity? The project had begun quietly, with permission for what officials called soil stability surveys. The equipment looked harmless, designed to measure density variations that might threaten monuments with unseen subsidence. The geophysicists came armed with low-frequency acoustic sensors and ground-penetrating transducers, slipping them into prefabricated slots cut near the base. Their plan was simple: send inaudible sound waves into the rock, time the rebounds, and translate each echo into a contour map showing what lay below. The waves traveled in pulses, some short as heartbeats, others stretched to 10 seconds, painting a subterranean picture by degrees of tone rather than light. The early test grids showed fluctuations typical of layered limestone, compressions, pockets, and old fissures that had hardened centuries ago. But farther beneath the front paws, two returns came back louder than expected, not diffused or ragged like natural gaps. The energy reflected sharply, as if it had struck a wall plane. When the technicians adjusted frequency, alternating between 25 and 75 Hz, the forms gained shape, one roughly rectangular, another smaller yet symmetric, both extending east to west. At an estimated depth of 30 feet, the voids ran parallel to each other with alignment precise enough to disturb even cautious scientists. Not everyone on site agreed on what that meant. One of the Egyptian geological surveyors leaned against the equipment van and said simply, "The rock here sometimes plays tricks." He had watched machines like this run before, across temple platforms and ancient quarries. Air pockets, he said. Density shifts from salt veins. The American engineers nodded, polite but unswayed. They didn't often see faults bind themselves in 90-degree corners beneath a monument carved from a single ridge of stone. In private, they marked their logs with faint asterisks, small superstitions of science. The collaboration itself sat at an uneasy border. Half the funding had come from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, a Virginia-based group devoted to Edgar Cayce's prophecies about the Hall of Records. The rest was covered by scientists affiliated with State University of New York and a few Egyptian geophysicists interested in applied seismic mapping. This mixture of faith and academia created more friction than anyone admitted aloud. During fieldwork, the word Atlantis was never used, though it hung in the dry heat like static. At night, some of the technicians walked to a tea stall near the plateau road, careful to speak softly among the local guards who kept watch after tourists. By morning, film plots lay scattered across the instrument table. Pencil ticks and faint pen marks showed subsurface profiles. Most read as expected surface refraction. A few didn't. The technician, his glasses slipping down his nose, pointed to one chart where the wave path bent back on itself, forming a neat loop. He knew the rules of the discipline. Any shape that looked too artificial might simply be interference. Yet part of him lingered on the possibility that geometry itself could whisper. Later, as sun crept higher over the dunes, he would pack the film canisters into cardboard sleeves and label them for shipping. Somewhere between data and story, the same heat haze quivered. When the results reached preliminary analysts, the wording in internal memos grew cautious. Anomalies of rectangular form, one summary read, denser than expected margins. Public press statements, however, condensed it to inhomogeneities consistent with natural fissuring. The language of science often served as camouflage. The same data could stand on two legs depending on who looked. To the international sponsors and mystic adherents, the rectangular reflections meant chambers, rooms sealed long before dynastic Egypt. To archaeology officials wary of outside claims, were mere lesson plans for geology students. Every phrasing carried political weight, and caution became its own dialect. Supporters suggested that one chamber might connect inward toward the Sphinx temple, via a corridor carved along a slight incline. The symmetry of readings on both sides hinted at a linking passage. Some even proposed it as an ancient floodway or ceremonial entry sealed during restoration phases in antiquity. Critics countered that any such shape could owe itself to fault compression and travertine deposits that form straight-edged patterns. In truth, the evidence sat closer to pattern than certainty, rectangular signals in the dark whose resolution stopped just short of clarity. Behind the instruments, humans kept their own rhythm. The team leader, bearded and pale from the desert sun, wrote notes beneath a weak desk lamp. The paper smelled faintly of dust and plastic film. On one sheet, he sketched a simple map. Two cavities, a narrow direction leading toward the temple enclosure. The drawing looked more architectural than geological. He paused, wondering how much meaning could hide in a frequency echo and whether imagination had amplified it. A soft cough came from the guard outside. The workday was over. In silence, he folded the sketch into his notebook, as though it carried a secret weight. Within weeks, news of the anomalies filtered beyond the lab. Rumors traveled through cafes in Cairo and reached small-town radio hosts who preferred wonder to restraint. Hidden rooms discovered beneath the Sphinx, headlines murmured. The official Egyptian Geological Survey, pressed for comment, confirmed only the presence of unusual subsurface features. That single phrase echoed louder than any instrument pulse. Scientists who had carefully neutral intent found themselves labeled the Atlantis team. One even received warning letters advising against unpermitted excavation. Information, it seemed, obeyed politics faster than physics. Yet fragments of those results slipped quietly into later academic abstracts. Data tables omitted direct references to chambers, but preserved measurements. Depth around 10 meters, estimated width 3 to 5. A few Egyptian staff privately admitted the readings were too geometric for comfort. That quiet statement would never appear in journals, but circulated among geologists like a shared rumor, the kind that surfaces only over coffee after conferences. Every discipline keeps its ghost stories, and this became one of them. The anomaly maps drawn across transparent film remain stored in climate-controlled archives, linked to both American and Egyptian partners. Inside those translucent sheets, the empty spaces looked almost living, like X-rays of thought caught under the limestone frame. One geophysicist described how, when holding the film up to light, he could see the symmetry align eerily with the structure's chest and forepaws. He didn't publish that observation, not because it was unverifiable, but because it sounded too dreamlike for data. The field respects evidence, but seldom knows what to do with poetry. By the close of field season, the desert regained its quiet rhythm. Wind passed over the plateau, slipping between the Sphinx's damaged features. The excavation pits were filled, leaving only the faint outline of equipment tracks fading into sand. Tourists resumed their photographs, unaware that beneath the pores lay lines on film suggesting a grid no one could dig down to see. The technicians boarded flights home with dust still clinging to their boots. The data, boxed and labeled, began its slower journey through layers of review that few outside the project would ever read. Late that year, during a private presentation to Egyptian officials, a summarized set of scans was projected onto a white wall. Lines of brighter tone showed concentrated echoes, solid here, hollow there. The attending director raised a brow but said little. It was enough that the presentation ended without commitment. No excavation followed. Permissions expired quietly. The final report noted, possible man-altered substructure bracketed with the phrase, requires verification. Verification never came. The instruments fell silent, but those rectangular voids did not erase themselves. They merely remained unaddressed, lying below as unsent letters from the past. Some whisper that the reluctance to reopen study stemmed from fear that aligning Cayce's coordinates with modern science might blur the boundaries both sides needed to keep. Others dismissed this, pointing to budget constraints and preservation law. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Unverified data sealed beneath bureaucracy as firmly as stone. In place of further tests came replicas, and restoration work meant to stabilize the already fragile monument. The deeper readings would wait, perhaps for better instruments, or for a time when politics could afford curiosity. Years later, digital copies of those seismic charts surfaced in private archives. The scans, faint yet unmistakable, marked anomaly zones under the front pores and extended fault-like streaks leading toward the temple trench. Comparing these to more recent radar imaging from the early 2000s, subtle overlaps appeared. Both indicated density channels, narrow signatures of space shaped by human intent or by chance symmetrical erosion. The coincidence lay too precisely along the temple axis to ignore. Some engineers found the alignment particularly striking, a quiet echo of architectural foresight that shouldn't exist in random geology. In the quiet hours of their laboratories, a few researchers replayed the old sound files captured beside the Sphinx. The recordings were mostly white noise punctuated by faint reverberations. Still, one could almost hear rhythm beneath randomness. Listening to that static, they heard not proof, but potential, an architectural breath waiting in the limestone. For them, the monument no longer felt like dead rock, but a living archive translating through frequency. The legend of the Hall of Records, once dismissed as prophecy alone, now had coordinates named by physics itself. The next step should have been simple: return, verify, excavate. Yet the more measurements approached that point of certainty, the more politics stirred. Heritage ministries hesitated, protective charters tightened, and joint projects dissolved in paperwork. To this day, the anomalies remain officially unexplored. Beneath the official reports lies a thin trace of denial mixed with restraint. The desert still carries that low hum at night, the same resonance that moved through the instruments 3 decades ago. It is faint but steady, like a heart just beneath stone, indifferent to permission, waiting only for another pulse of sound to find it again. But what happened to those results once politics awakened? When the data reached Cairo, it stopped moving. Boxes of charts and reels were brought into the Ministry of Antiquities just after the morning call to prayer faded over the rooftops. Inside, the corridors breathed a bureaucratic heat. Paper, dust, perfume, and sweat mixing with the faint scent of limestone clinging to field equipment. A clerk logged the arrival, stamped the import forms, and carried the documents through an unmarked door behind an archway. By evening, the paper trail had already begun to vanish. The survey team who delivered their findings never received a receipt, only an assurance that a review would happen very soon. In 1993, Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities held every excavator's future between its signature lines. Under Zahi Hawass, the office controlled not just digging rights but also data release and film permission. The seismic readings from the base of the Sphinx arrived with academic endorsements attached, yet still carried a faint odor of controversy from their American sponsors. The files included cross-sectional maps showing geometric voids beneath the forepaws, each labeled cautiously as potential low-density anomalies. Getting them cleared meant getting each label blessed by committee seals. Weeks went by without word, then months. While outside the ministry gates, the desert resumed its steady hush. Some accounts speak of the moment an internal memo circulated instructing that no reports concerning chambers or tunnels are to be released without central approval. Heritage protection was the official reason, security perhaps another. The geologists used to the open sharing of seismic records found themselves caught in a different logic entirely, a world where geological data could be treated like state secrets. The Sphinx, after all, wasn't a hill or a cavern. It was a national symbol, and national symbols could not be tampered with lightly. An American researcher, his name slips between sources, spent a week waiting for signatures that never came. Each day he sat in a courtyard that smelled faintly of diesel and hibiscus, his iron shirt growing salt rings in the noon glare. The reels inside his briefcase carried echoes from the plateau, reflections of pulses fired deep into the bedrock only weeks earlier. On each reel, a thin strip of magnetic tape hummed softly in its metal casing, holding what might have been the most detailed underground portrait of the Sphinx ever recorded. Yet each morning the guard at the gate told him, not today. Inside that same compound, decisions were being shaped by competing pressures. Egypt's archaeological authority had always walked the line between scholarship and politics, weighing foreign access against nationalist stewardship. Hawass, at that time both gatekeeper and showman, publicly championed Egypt's narrative of continuity, pharaohs to nationhood, sand to sovereignty. To him, a rumor of secret vaults built before Egypt's own dynasties wasn't just bad science, it risked becoming bad diplomacy. When journalists called for comment, his official reply was simple: no chambers confirmed. Yet among researchers, another phrase began to circulate: unexplained subsurface features. According to a few who saw early summaries, portions of the seismic data hinted at rectangular echoes too sharp to be dismissed as faults. The leaked abstracts described zones of symmetry oriented exactly beneath the front left paw, extending toward the body's centerline. Their depth matched the predicted location of the so-called Hall of Records from Cayce's trance readings decades earlier, a coincidence nearly impossible to ignore. If nature made those shapes, she had done so with a suspicious sense of geometry. Still, without excavation rights, evidence could go no further. Subsequent proposals referencing localized hollow structures were swiftly rejected for endangering the Sphinx's foundation. Publicly, Hawass maintained that nothing unusual rested beneath the monument. Privately, he may have been less certain. Some archives mention a brief midnight inspection with a radar unit borrowed from the military. Afterward, permits for all foreign-led surveys were suspended. The record falls silent there, leaving only the question of what the radar had seen or hadn't. The following year brought an NBC television special portraying the seismic discovery as proof of ancient secrets. For Cairo's authorities, it was an embarrassment. Egypt's cooperation had been negotiated for science, not spectacle, and now journalists framed the anomaly as a doorway to Atlantis. To restore control of the story, Hawass revoked several standing permits, accusing the film crew of exaggeration. The same week, crates containing uncleaned rock samples were ordered shipped back to customs until further notice. Within academic circles, the episode served as a warning. Flirt too closely with the mystical fringe, and your credentials might not survive to the next grant cycle. Peer pressure did the rest. Anthropologists and geologists alike knew that careers could dry out faster than desert clay. To question the official timeline of the Sphinx risked labels like pseudoscience or speculative archaeology. Such terms carried weight at international conferences, where publication records determined not only reputation but livelihood. One Egyptian assistant later recalled how a senior scholar quietly advised him to forget the anomalies if he wanted to finish his thesis. He did. Many did. Meanwhile, the Association for Enlightenment, founded by followers of Edgar Cayce, continued funding expeditions, convinced their psychic roadmap was bearing fruit. Their quiet sponsorship of radar tests under official cooperation blurred the boundary between science and spiritualism. On paper, these were standard geological surveys. In practice, they were part pilgrimage, part data gathering, and fully dependent on Egypt's mood that month. When foreign press reports linked the funding back to Cayce's prophecies, Hawass erupted publicly, calling the work American hallucinations. The partnership dissolved overnight, yet whispers suggest that some findings were quietly copied before repatriation orders arrived. By the mid-1990s, at least 2 additional censored documentaries mentioned a hidden shaft to the north of the Sphinx. One claimed to show Hawass himself climbing into a narrow tunnel lined with blocks smoother than natural limestone. The footage was never released. Producers hinted that legal threats had frozen distribution. No one could confirm whether the film reel still existed. This pattern, brief discovery followed by bureaucratic blackout, became almost rhythmic, a choreography of near revelation. In academic journals, every mention of the Sphinx's voids was stripped down to technical understatement. Localized heterogeneities consistent with natural cavities, one line read. The wording concealed more than it revealed. Outside peer-reviewed pages, Cairo cafes buzzed with rumors. Some said the data showed steps carved into the bedrock. Others swore it revealed chambers flooded long ago and refilled with sand. None could show proof. What remained was the silence, an absence thick enough to invite its own mythology. Those close to the surveys noted a peculiar shift. Once the data became controversial, conversations turned from geology to loyalty. Prospective collaborators were asked informal questions about past writings, funding sources, or spiritual beliefs. A single mention of Atlantis could end negotiations before they began. The Sphinx, always a creature of riddles, now carried a political one: how to study an object of faith without becoming part of a faith yourself. The evening light on the Giza Plateau can feel almost metallic, copper mixing with dust and the smell of camel sweat. In that glare, the statue's ancient contours lose their sharpness, blending into the dunes until it almost disappears. It's easy to see why officials guarded it so tightly. Any new narrative, Atlantean architects, pre-dynastic engineers, or alien surveyors, could erode more than limestone. It could chip away at Egypt's guardianship of its own history. Facing that risk, a sealed file drawer must have seemed like the safest sandbox. Years later, a quiet admission would surface from the same authority. Interviewed off-record, an official acknowledged man-made spaces in proximity to the Sphinx, but dismissed them as unrelated to any mythical archive. That choice of words, neither denial nor confirmation, traveled fast through the halls of speculation. Man-made spaces could mean anything from maintenance tunnels to unfinished tombs. But paired with memories of confiscated radar data, it sounded like an echo from those forbidden reels. Observers noted that Egypt treated its digital seismic data as state property, classifiable under national heritage protection. In effect, ownership of the Sphinx's subsurface image belonged not to the researchers who scanned it, but to the government. Asking for copies became equivalent to requesting classified material. This legal framing, though standard inside Egypt, baffled Western scientists. It meant that even empty space beneath the monument could become confidential. Media cycles amplified misunderstanding. One tabloid called it proof of secret vaults, another simply reported technical glitch. The noise buried every nuance. Researchers who once dreamed of collaboration now retreated to safer topics: erosion analysis, restoration history, or survey technology. Their silence wasn't born of defeat. It was a survival strategy. For those who persisted, doors literally stopped opening. Letters went unanswered. Emails looped through formal thank yous without commitments. For Egypt, the matter appeared closed, and yet the data never disappeared. Copies circulated quietly between academics, half-whispered like contraband. Some of these replicas, decades old, still sit on private drives, preserved by retired scientists unwilling to see them lost entirely. What they contain, no one publicly knows. But the fact they remain unpublished sustains the anomaly like a hidden heartbeat, inaudible but measurable by rumor alone. The story didn't fade because measurements disproved the cavities. It faded because conversation became dangerous. For historians, the terrain turned political. For geologists, professional. For Egypt, existential. The Sphinx could endure storms, but controversy threatened the delicate balance between heritage and hypothesis. And so the compromise prevailed. Neither excavation nor denial, only postponement. Sometimes postponement lasts a lifetime. A few members of the original seismic team passed away still waiting for clearance letters. Their field notes described the Giza sand as a kind of soft sensor, covering everything until the surface forgot what lay underneath. Now their findings drift between archive rumor and myth, a memory of echoes once printed on film and stored in unmarked cases. What emerges from this long quiet isn't proof of secrets, but proof of how secrets form. A pause in an office here, a withheld permit there, and soon, a mystery builds itself from paperwork alone. Each rumor fills the vacuum left by each unanswered question. Over time, the pause hardens into legend. By now, the line between evidence and administration blurs. The sealed boxes in Cairo hold both the literal magnetic tapes and the symbolic weight of unanswered possibility. Within academic circles, the absence became almost as intriguing as the discovery itself. Could a withheld result be more compelling than a revealed one? It seems the Sphinx had found a new way to challenge humanity, by making its watchers complicit in the riddle. The quiet may have served its purpose. Controversy dulled, foreign expeditions shifted their lenses elsewhere, and the Sphinx continued facing east, its expression eroded but not unguarded. Beneath it, perhaps only void, perhaps an archive of stone. What mattered to Cairo was control, the right to decide when curiosity crosses the border of trust, and still the coordinates linger. They reappear in new studies, in digital reconstructions, even in the background data of unrelated projects. Each time the Sphinx is mapped with modern sensors, researchers whisper the same thought. Will we see the same shapes again? So far, no survey has entirely erased them. The anomaly remains threaded through layers of geological probability and political memory. The file may stay sealed a little longer, but the echo under the Sphinx hasn't gone anywhere. It waits, wrapped in protocols and the desert's low hum, daring someone to listen again. From here, the trail widens, toward stone that bears the mark of ancient rain, and a geologist who claimed the monument remembered storms older than Egypt itself. Around the Sphinx's body, the stone ripples like waves, frozen mid-motion. The sunlight hits its flanks, sliding over hollows that look more carved by water than by wind. The grooves curl downward in soft, rounded channels, as if millennia ago rain had poured against its sides and left fingerprints in the limestone. It's an odd sight here on the edge of the Sahara, where water is almost a rumor now. The desert presses quiet against the monument, but the surface of the Sphinx seems to whisper of storms that used to fall from a vanished sky. That quiet contradiction drew a geologist named Robert Schoch to Giza in the early 1990s. Trained at Yale, he approached the Sphinx not as an archaeologist, but as someone used to reading the language of stone. Examining its enclosure, those tall, uneven walls where the monument's massive body was carved directly from the bedrock, he noticed that the patterns on the rock didn't match the desert's typical scars. Instead of crisp, horizontal where shaped by blowing sand, many sections had deep vertical channels and rounded edges, the signature of running water. The clues were subtle, faint curves in a surface that time had already blurred, but they spoke with the calm certainty of geology. Schoch followed those lines down the carved walls, murmuring over datasets and photos taken from every angle. When he cross-checked the patterns with known processes, one conclusion stood out. Rain. Not a drizzle, not desert humidity, but long-term, saturating rainfall, the kind that reshapes stone. The issue was not whether rain could have done it, but when such rain had last touched this ground. The Sahara, according to climate records, had not seen sustained wet years in several thousand years. The Sphinx, then dated to Pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BCE, should have stood in near-total aridity for nearly all of its life, yet the rock looked older, worn by a climate that predated the desert itself. His idea wasn't simple revision, it was an invitation to rethink an entire era. Schoch aligned the clues with paleoclimatic data showing stretches of heavy rainfall that ended somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago near the close of the last ice age. If the weathering was truly caused by rain, the Sphinx, or at least the body around which it was carved, might belong to that wetter epoch. Some found the idea thrilling, others unsettling, a relic that would have stood centuries before the first kings of Egypt raised stone walls or cut hieroglyphs into slabs. Mainstream Egyptologists were quick to respond. They argued that the same patterns could emerge from more ordinary processes, salt crystallization, where groundwater seeps into the stone, soft layers eroding faster than hard ones, or simple wear from countless restoration efforts. They pointed to records of the monument being buried and re-excavated over centuries, cycles that could easily produce differential stress in the limestone. They noted that nearby temples used blocks quarried from the same formation, linking both to Khafre's reign, a connection that still stands as the prevailing view. The stone, they said, doesn't need ancient rainstorms to explain its scars. If the academic debate felt distant, the stone itself felt anything but. Beneath the Sphinx's flank, when bent close enough, the texture changes from smooth dust to pitted channels. The scent of the rock carries a faint tang of minerals, the smell of fossils that once slept in seawater. Under the fingers of field geologists, those curves soften like eroded riverbeds. They brush away wind-blown grit and trace parallel lines upward to the chest of the statue, where the grooves end abruptly at a restoration seam. To them, it's not just data, it's a conversation with time, one syllable at a time. Supporting clues appeared beyond Giza. Schoch compared the Sphinx's enclosure walls with natural formations known to have been weathered by rainfall, the rounded cliffs of the southwestern United States, certain ancient outcrops in Africa and the Near East. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but the overall pattern fit. The vertical fluting, the scalloped edges, the absence of sharp, angular breakage, all spoke of water movement across soft stone. His photographs lined up next to those of sites shaped by ancient rain, and the reflection was uncanny enough to sustain the theory. Critics countered that water erosion alone could not explain everything. The western wall of the Sphinx's enclosure, for instance, showed noticeably less damage than the eastern and southern sides. To them, that uneven wear suggested differences in rock quality or protection during burial, not age. A few pointed out that the monument's core layers vary in hardness, meaning some erode quickly while others resist. Over thousands of years, such variation could mimic the very pattern Cayce described. Limestone is capricious like that. What looks ancient can sometimes be recent chemistry at work. Still, climate records weigh heavily. Core samples from the Nile Valley and beyond reveal that intense seasonal rain once swept across this region, on and off, until roughly 5000 BCE. Between 10 and 8,000 years before present, much of North Africa was green savanna dotted with lakes. To attribute the Sphinx's features to that humid epoch would mean accepting that colossal architecture, or at least advanced quarrying, existed here long before the dynastic timeline allows. The thought unsettled established chronology in the same way water unsettles dry soil. At the heart of the disagreement lies a question of evidence versus narrative. Archaeologists hold an unbroken thread of cultural continuity, linking Khafre to the Sphinx. The nearby temples built from its surrounding stone blocks, the stylistic matches and artifacts bearing the 4th dynasty mark. Cayce's geology offered a separate thread that tugged earlier into prehistory. Both threads seem to attach firmly to their own anchors. The tension between them hums quietly every time rain clouds drift over Giza and pass without a drop. There's a tactile reality to this argument that photographs rarely show. During field campaigns in the 1990s, geologists often worked crouched at odd angles in the narrow enclosure, the air dense with heat. Some knelt for hours, following a single groove with calloused fingers. They noted where grains of quartz had been rounded by dissolution instead of sandblasting. They muttered over layer transitions, chalked boundaries, sketched profiles. At dusk the stone cooled under their touch, rough at first, then faintly damp from condensation, an echo of the moisture that may have shaped it long ago. One of those late evenings, Cayce wrote about how certain sections along the body curved inward gently, as if polished by runoff rather than scraped by wind. He described his surprise that these forms existed even below areas known to have been buried under desert sands for centuries. If true, such subsurface weathering had to predate the burial, meaning the sculpted walls had felt rain before they were ever hidden. Whether that rain belonged to an early formative phase of the monument or to a repurposed natural ridge remained open, but the geology leaned toward water, persistent, ancient, and soft. The counter-arguments endure. Egyptologists point out that restoration work began nearly as soon as the monument was carved. Plastering, recutting, recarving, all of it complicating the record. Salt crystallization, they remind us, can split limestone through internal pressure, forming channels remarkably similar to those caused by dripping water. Measurements done on nearby structures, built from the same bedrock, show matching degradation levels, suggesting uniform weathering within the span of the Pharaonic period. No floods needed, just chemistry and time. Yet the stone's quiet persuasion still lingers. If you walk the enclosure floor today, the scars differ from wall to wall, but each curve leads back to a single impression, that the monument has known a climate unthinkable for its supposed age. The erosional scrolls wrap around its body like signatures of vanished rain. High above, the Sphinx's face, recarved and patched, feels almost new by comparison, a mask placed over an older skeleton. Supporters of Cayce's view call this difference the telltale mark of a restoration culture, later dynasties repairing what they revered but did not understand. The rest of the geological record deepens that sense of age. Nearby depressions on the Giza Plateau show similar rounded wear patterns, though less pronounced. Outcrops farther south hold traces of runoff channels from the same epoch when Egypt was part of a lush savanna. These parallels do not prove anything outright, but they add weight to the feeling that Giza's stones belong to a world wetter than ours. Some researchers outside traditional Egyptology quietly use this evidence to argue for cycles of civilization rising and falling with climate, each leaving fragments behind. Whether that suggestion points to humanity's forgotten chapter, or simply to geological patience, is an open question. When Schoch's results were first presented, they unsettled conference rooms more than deserts. The idea that such precision carving could predate recorded history by millennia hinted at lost technologies, or at least lost communities capable of engineering on a vast scale. Critics dismissed this leap as romantic speculation, insisting that geology cannot rewrite civilization's timeline. Still, in public imagination, the argument took on a life of its own. The Sphinx became more than an ancient guardian. It became a witness, possibly from an age before the written word, before kingship, before sand replaced grass. Even within sober debate, one fact feels inescapable. Weather leaves signatures that are difficult to fake. Rainwater, seeping and pooling, undercut stone differently than sand abrasion or wind gusts. In the Sphinx enclosure, those marks appear with stubborn regularity. The opposing voices explain them through chemical erosion and human repair, but every explanation carries its own gaps. Salt can pit rock, but not usually in deep vertical ribbons. Wind cuts sideways, not down. The Sphinx's scars seem to ignore the logic of their environment. Tonight, the monument sleeps under a hard moon, a sculpture shaped by absence. The air is dry enough to crack skin, yet its flanks retain the memory of flow. Perhaps that contradiction explains why the hypothesis endures, because it asks not only what happened, but when the desert began to forget the rain. Whether or not Schoch is correct, his claim forces the question: if the Sphinx once stood in a green world, how many other relics still lie buried beneath dunes that used to be rivers? A soft breeze brushes the plateau, stirring sand against the enclosure walls. The chisel grooves catch a faint shadow, each one a reminder that stone keeps better records than paper. Those ridges, flowing like the ghosts of waterfalls, form a diary written in mineral language. The rock doesn't lie easily. Its surface argues in quiet detail that once, long ago, the Sphinx looked out not over desert, but over grass, water, and storm. It suggests a memory of weather that no pharaoh ever saw. If that reading of age is true, even in part, then the Sphinx is far older than the civilization that claimed it. Older than the Great Pyramid, older than the kings whose faces supposedly mirror its own. Perhaps that is why the monument feels timeless, its body made in one epoch, its face in another. The argument carved into its walls remains undecided. Yet one thing is certain. The more closely you study the weathering, the more it seems the Sphinx remembers rain. The surface bears stories not of wind, but of water, pressed deep into limestone like a forgotten script. And if its outer skin holds such memory, what of its heart? Beneath those eroded layers may lie older stones still untouched by daylight, rock that predates the last floods, sealed since the dawn of the desert. If the surface speaks of vanished rain, the depths might murmur of what came before it. The question that follows settles softly in the night air, heavier than sand. If the Sphinx truly carries the marks of a forgotten world above, what waits sealed below it? Giza's plateau behaves like a layered machine, temples above, tunnels below, and something unseen connecting the two through corridors cut into bedrock. In the thin morning haze, the stones still carry traces of salt. The ancient drainage lines gleam when dew gathers, giving the impression of an enormous circuit that once pulsed with motion. Standing at the edge of that complex, it's easy to feel the geometry beneath your feet, even without seeing it. Straight channels running where bedrock should be solid, breaks in symmetry that hint at hands far older than any name we know. Researchers have long noticed how carefully the site's structures fit together. The Valley Temple, carved directly from the same limestone as the Sphinx, connects through trenches that vanish underneath the lion-bodied guardian. Nearby shafts drop straight down into the ground, some so narrow that only a camera lowered by rope can reach the water below. The most infamous of these is the Osiris shaft, a vertical descent that ends in a half-flooded chamber cut with stone boxes and walkways, discovered beneath the causeway leading to Khafre's pyramid. Its walls are smooth where they should be rough, as though the builders sculpted the rock to imitate a tunnel instead of simply removing stone. Supporters suggest that this shaft isn't a simple tomb, but part of a more extensive network, a skeleton key to Giza's subterranean design. Its alignment points toward the Sphinx complex, echoing the same engineering logic seen in the drainage lines that run beneath the temples. You might think of it as the maintenance system of a civilization that treated rock like architecture's bloodstream, circulating air, water, or a ritual procession. Critics counter that these links are coincidence, the natural outcome of carving temples where limestone strata already cracked and fractured. To them, the so-called blueprint of tunnels is nothing more than geology dressed up by human imagination. Yet, for all the dispute, evidence keeps resurfacing. In summer dig seasons when rainwater pools along the base of the Sphinx, tiny bubbles rise in patterns that map to known hollows beneath. Archaeologists monitoring the site have observed how water drains faster in areas aligned with underground conduits. The soil behaves peculiarly. Collapsing inward along straight seems invisible to the eye. Each time the surface gives way, even just a few centimeters, it sketches a faint diagram across the sand, lines intersecting like rails under decades of drift. Night work at the plateau adds a stranger texture. Workers from the restoration crews, often local men accustomed to the desert's unpredictable moods, recount lowering cameras into the Osiris shaft. The lenses fog immediately from the humidity trapped below. Condensation gathers in beads on cables, dripping rhythmically into the black water. The lights pierce the flooding and reveal stacked levels, one beneath another, until the signal cuts out. In those seconds before the feed dies, the floor appears grooved, as if steps vanish deeper than anyone has measured. They describe the echo that follows the camera's fall. Not a hard splash, but something muted, reverberating off long, hollow stone. The Sphinx's immediate surroundings display similar puzzles. A trench traces the creature's perimeter, linking to channels that push runoff toward the adjoining temple. Some whisper that during ancient floods this network kept the monument dry, functioning as a primitive drainage grid. Others wonder whether those shafts once linked to ritual catwalks connecting the Sphinx temple, the Valley Temple, and the Pyramid Causeway, an entire ceremonial engine buried under the sand. Either way, design intent is hard to ignore. These aren't random fissures, they run straight and true, like conduits drawn with a surveyor's eye. When the 1990 seismic scans mapped rectangular voids beneath the Sphinx's forepaws, the data seemed to align with the same underground pattern traced by those shafts. That geometric consistency, right angles, balanced spacing, proportional distances didn't match natural fissuring. To a geologist it was curiosity, to a mystic confirmation. A few reports hinted that one cavity descended along an axis pointing to the Great Pyramid's base, suggesting a corridor carved purposefully beneath both monuments. Official language stayed cautious. Density variations, subsurface inconsistencies. But behind the published words, the concept of a planned subterranean grid began to whisper louder. Some Egyptologists maintain that these features served pragmatic needs, water flow, construction drainage, or symbolic passage for funerary rituals, and that explanation holds weight. Ancient architecture often blended engineering with ceremony. To drain the floodplain near the Nile's edge, channels were carved and used for centuries. Yet the level of precision on Giza's plateau appears excessive for mere practicality. The channels taper evenly, follow consistent gradients, and reconnect after long runs with no apparent error. It feels more like infrastructure than improvisation. Supporters point to similar mastery in other early sites. At Abydos, subterranean galleries run with similar alignment beneath temples predating Khafre. In the necropolis of Saqqara, narrow corridors link burial chambers across distances that exceed visual range. Yet they meet cleanly, proof of surveying skill more advanced than typically credited to Old Kingdom builders. These parallels suggest that the engineers who planned Giza's plateau were executing a broader schema already perfected elsewhere. If so, the Sphinx may stand over the nexus, the point where everything converged. What if the Sphinx wasn't built primarily as a statue, but as a marker? Its gaze fixed east as if tracking cycles of time, the monument could denote the entrance to an unseen realm of chambers. The notion reappears across ancient records, the guardian figure watching over thresholds between surface and underworld. Whether practical or spiritual, the symbolism fits neatly. Some whisper of older civilizations reusing the site, expanding tunnels that pre-dynastic peoples had already hollowed out. Each generation added its layer of purpose, burial, worship, memory, without ever erasing what came before. Below those layers, measurements continue to perplex. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed textures resembling stair-stepped patterns under the Valley Temple, matching the depth of the Osiris shaft but offset by several meters. To engineers, such geometry hints at human planning. To skeptics, it is wishful pattern reading. During one inspection, a structural engineer noted a harmonic resonance when striking certain limestone blocks, tones varying slightly from neighboring sections, as though cavities resonated beneath them. Small differences, easily missed, but enough to stir questions about what lies unseen connecting temple and statue. When rain briefly floods the trenches, the water's movement tells another story. It flows toward a consistent eastward line, pooling near the Sphinx Road and eventually disappearing into drains whose ends remain undocumented. Engineers measuring the flow find that the slope is too intentional to be accidental. Over centuries of restoration, attempts to seal these drains often fail. The water insists on returning to its hidden roots, carving anew through fill and mortar. The desert, it seems, remembers its pathways better than any blueprint. Explanations vary. Some geologists argue that the whole phenomenon is a natural palimpsest, the rock evolving over millennia of alternating flood and drought, its fractures later mistaken for human work. Yet the ordered symmetry continues to trouble that view. Chambers discovered beneath other dynastic temples show similar construction techniques. Shafts cut straight down, floors leveled to near-perfect planes. Such precision suggests measurement tools and methods long thought absent in that era. Perhaps then, Giza's plateau was not merely a necropolis of tombs, but part of an engineered landscape of control, of water, of ceremony, of cosmological alignment. Under the lens of that idea, the Sphinx's role changes. It becomes the lock on the doorway, the sentinel above a system of design both practical and symbolic. In this reading, the tunnels beneath were not afterthoughts but foundations, channels prepared long before the statue took shape. Maybe the carvers shaped the lion's body later, responding to a structure already in place. Some archaeologists quietly entertain the notion that the Sphinx rests atop an older civilization's framework, its paws sealing the threshold to deeper architecture, now inaccessible. The desert's wind covers but doesn't erase. Workers restoring the site often glimpse this continuity firsthand. When they remove sand or patch eroded stone, new seams appear that align unnaturally with distant sections. One mason describes shadows falling evenly through fissures between paws and base, as if sunlight knew where to pass. Moments like those feed quiet superstition among crews that the Sphinx is aware of its alignment, holding secrets in patience. Whether shrugged off as coincidence or honored as mystery, those sensations color every dig. Viewed from a modern engineering perspective, the plateau's layout behaves almost like an integrated system. The Great Pyramid's core passages point toward both solar and stellar targets. The Valley Temple's channels carry runoff to the same substructures marked by sediment below the Sphinx. Together they form a pattern, modular, hierarchical, methodical. It resembles urban planning scaled for eternity rather than daily living. Perhaps the ancients conceived architecture as a mirror of cosmology, drawing energy lines across the limestone to reflect the sky's perfection on Earth. Or perhaps the design was literal, a flood control and drainage network misread by centuries of storytelling. Either interpretation offers awe. Under the calm sands exists evidence of methodology that defies simple categorization, stones whispering mathematics we barely translate. Excavations continue carefully, each shovel of sand weighed against the risk of collapse. The workers who descend into the shafts do so silently, mindful of gases and water pressure. Their lights illuminate inscriptions that crumble when touched, traces of pigment left by workers long gone. Those fleeting colors, red, black, ochre, suggest different teams marking stone as though following construction codes rather than ritual decoration. The architectural language under the Sphinx might once have instructed crews how to build, not how to pray. Every tunnel verified adds weight to that impression. The deeper the exploration goes, the more repetition appears, angles measured to similar tolerances, junctions placed at proportional intervals, patterns too deliberate for happenstance. Each discovery presses the question further. Were these passageways mere servant routes for flooded ground, or evidence of a lost phase in Egyptian design? So far, no one can say. The hieroglyphs above ground speak of kings and gods. The voids below remain voiceless but exact. From this distance, the plateau feels less like a collection of isolated monuments and more like one instrument carved in stone, its components designed to resonate across both time and geography. The Sphinx anchors this network like the circuit's ground wire, its body connecting the upper temples to whatever chambers still rest unopened beneath. When viewed aerially, the layout hums with symmetry. Pathways, shafts, and lined trenches form what could be read as a schematic, a kind of ancient urban circuitry. Each part sustains the others, united by precision that predates most recorded tools. If such geometric fluency is real, it raises quiet wonder. Who measured the bedrock first? Which minds turned raw landscape into a living diagram, balancing water, weight, and celestial reference so perfectly that it persists after 5,000 years of erosion? The fragments we've recovered, the Osiris shaft, the cut trenches, the persistent flood drains suggest the work of artists who understood both geology and hydraulics intimately, not superstition but science in an unfamiliar language. Each new map drawn beneath the plateau expands that mystery. Beneath the lion's body, the desert's wiring diagram grows denser, lines overlapping until interpretation blurs. Some say we've barely skimmed the surface of what lies beneath. Others believe the true vaults were filled long before dynastic records began. Either way, the map keeps unfolding, linking the Sphinx not only to its neighboring pyramids, but perhaps to a global rhythm waiting to be traced again. Now the trail widens, beyond Egypt's horizon, toward other continents where similar watchers stand guard over forgotten gates. When a myth walks into a laboratory, the air tightens. Somewhere between the click of instruments and the soft thud of stone dust hitting paper masks, belief and data begin to share the same oxygen. It was within this narrow space that the Association for Research and Enlightenment, followers of Edgar Cayce, entered the quiet corridors of modern archaeology. Their aims sounded deceptively academic: study the Giza Plateau with new instruments. Yet beneath that phrasing sat a different ambition: the search for Cayce's Hall of Records, a library of ancient memory waiting under the Sphinx's paws. The boundary between prophecy and hypothesis blurred not through words, but through checkbooks, permits, and drills humming under Egyptian sun. The R had been forming its identity for years before its tools met the desert floor. Founded to preserve Cayce's transcripts and health writings, the group gradually turned toward his more esoteric predictions, the ones that spoke of Atlantis, of vanished civilizations scattering its survivors across Egypt, Yucatan, and the Andes. By the late 1970s, those prophecies met academia through an unlikely route: seismographs and radar. Reports from that decade record collaborations between the ARE, SRI International, and several geophysical consultants licensed to sweep Giza. To outside observers, it looked like harmless curiosity. Inside the association, it felt like validation in motion, as if the psychic's forgotten blueprints were becoming coordinates. Many university-trained archaeologists, however, kept their distance. Some feared their institutions could not survive another flirtation with what critics called fringe archaeology. Others felt that even lending expertise to such a venture might compromise years of cautious reputation. In whispered conversations outside conferences, one heard not outrage but unease, the same kind that flutters when faith enters a boardroom built for carbon dating. An American geologist from that era recalled lowering a small seismic transducer near the forepore of the Sphinx and, through the hum of generators, barely daring to say Cayce's name. He said it once, quietly, as if even vibration could summon ridicule. UNESCO's observers and Egyptian heritage officials were aware of the project's funding mix. On paper, the research complied with legal excavation oversight. Beneath the surface, tongues wagged about private sponsors with mystical motives. The global body that monitored cultural sites had long emphasized secular accountability. Data should serve heritage, not prophecy. Their guidelines, translated into a dozen languages, spoke of neutrality. Yet neutrality proved slippery when mystics paid for the technology. Each seismic echo returned both as a reading and as revelation. Through the view of faith, any cavity could become evidence of the whole. Through the eye of science, it could just as easily be a natural fissure, but that distinction rarely quieted belief once stirred. The tension reached its delicate peak in 1991, when a renewed collaboration linked the Ars Shore Foundation with geological researchers under partial Egyptian supervision. The desert air then carried more than dust, it carried competing narratives. On one hand, physicists checking resonance profiles of limestone strata. On the other, idealists interpreting each anomaly as a trace of Atlantean design. Egyptian authorities balancing national image with foreign capital allowed the studies under tight watch. In public, officials reiterated a familiar phrase: no chambers have been found beneath the Sphinx. In private, agreements shifted. Filmed footage of exploration sometimes vanished before broadcast, and permits quietly changed hands. The archaeologist most synonymous with Egypt's protective policies, Zahi Hawass, embodied this paradox. Known internationally as a defender of mainstream chronology, he also oversaw, and by extension approved, several mixed-team expeditions that included our affiliates. Publicly, he denounced talk of Atlantis as American hallucinations. Privately, according to witnesses like filmmaker Boris said, he entered the very tunnel such claims had inspired. Said later described filming a short descent under the Sphinx during what became known as the Shore Expedition. His version of events ended abruptly, citing political fallout and a documentary that never aired. Official archives list only mundane inspection work. The gap between those two accounts breathed new life into suspicion. Suspicion thrives on contradictions. Egypt's Council of Antiquities operated under a mandate to control every dig connected to its heritage, particularly after waves of looting and speculative exploitation earlier in the century. To that end, the Council reserved rights over data collected on site. Raw seismic files, radar images, temperature readings, each became part of a bureaucracy thicker than the stone itself. Scientists wishing to publish needed signatures from multiple ministries. For groups like the are accustomed to spiritual autonomy, the process felt like entering a temple controlled by gatekeepers who did not share their language of faith. Every pause, Every unreturned call could be interpreted as suppression. Supporters suggest that Cairo's bureaucrats were not malicious, merely cautious. The idea of Atlantis under the Sphinx risked overshadowing Egypt's national identity. The country's economy leaned heavily on tourism, and any claim of foreign supernatural builders could shift heritage pride into foreign myth. So, the official posture favored acknowledgement of natural geology, nothing more. UNESCO reinforced that stance, pushing for peer-reviewed transparency and discouraging association with esoteric organizations. Yet transparency could also mean exposure of unverified data, of rumors, of dreams that might collapse under public inspection. The easiest path was silence, and silence kept both worlds functioning. Academia preserved its credibility. Mystics retained their mystery. Meanwhile, inside laboratories funded partly through our donations, technicians processed the same desert scan skeptics dismissed. The beeping of the oscillographs, the faint hiss of the recording equipment, all folded into a strangely reverent background. Some of those scientists, their names lightly disguised in later memoirs, confessed to feeling a quiet guilt. They had accepted spiritual money for secular work. One wrote that he measured acoustic impedance while volunteers from the R meditated outside the research tent. He could hear their soft chanting through the windbreaks. It was odd, his field notes read, as if the stone listened too. Such moments, half professional and half mystical, gave the Sphinx fresh layers, not of limestone, but of human longing. By the mid-1990s, the Shaw Foundation reemerged with a new 5-year permit. Official language described radar mapping and environmental stabilization. Informal whispers centered on deeper aims, to locate the chamber that Cayce once placed precisely between the Sphinx's paws. Boris said, still involved, told radio audiences he had filmed inside these hidden rooms. His account spoke of clear-cut walls, sealed passageways, and Hawes himself guiding the filming. When the resulting footage never surfaced, conjecture filled the void. Some said legal disputes stopped release, others murmured about government embargo. The absence of proof became its own evidence to believers, a circular certainty typical of mysteries that feed on their own secrecy. In Alexandria and Luxor cafes, scholars argued about funding ethics. Should faith-based patrons be allowed to underwrite supposedly objective science? The analogy often drawn was medical research. If a prophet funds a lab, must the lab seek prophecy in its results? Supporters answered that curiosity wears many labels. Critics countered that motive shapes perception. Within that debate lay an uncomfortable truth. Modern archaeology, like ancient religion, depends on money. The purity of inquiry is rarely immune to the fingerprints of its financier. And when the financier reads the future as easily as the past, caution often replaces collaboration. Cultural politics further complicated everything. Western fascination with Egypt's deep time carried tones of both admiration and possession. American and European media loved stories that hinted at prehistoric geniuses or extraterrestrial architects. To Egyptians, these same stories often sounded like theft, narrative colonization disguised as curiosity. For Hawes and his peers, defending dynastic genius became a matter of sovereignty. Allowing outsiders to claim Atlantean ancestry for their monuments felt intolerable. The Ar's involvement with its overt Atlantic mysticism stirred old sensitivities. One historian compared it to tourists bringing their own ghosts into someone else's temple. Yet the cooperation continued, patchy but persistent. Equipment changed hands through shared permits, and foreign specialists remained on the ground. Reports written in sanitized academic tones appeared in minor journals, discussions of bedrock resonance, sand infiltration, humidity variation. What they didn't mention were the sponsors' parallel interpretations, the idea that those same readings might correspond to sealed knowledge from before recorded history. Supporters within the R interpreted bureaucratic lays as covert acknowledgement. They know but cannot say. For Egypt's ministry, those claims were public relations hazards. For scientists caught between both sides, the situation stretched professional vocabulary to its breaking point. One researcher from that period told an interviewer years later that he felt as though he worked under a microscope of belief. He monitored data in a shipping container repurposed as a control hut. On the shelf beside the printouts lay a small pamphlet about Cayce's visions of Egypt. It wasn't his, he claimed. Someone had left it there, but he never threw it away. Perhaps, he said, to remind himself that even science has its half-conscious rituals, the habits of reverence that sneak into methodology. Within the stable hum of air conditioners, the line between superstition and precision seemed less like a border and more like a spectrum. Eventually, UNESCO recommended stricter oversight for any Giza project involving private American sponsors. Egyptian authorities concurred, citing the need to avoid pseudo-archaeological misinterpretation. Permit structures were altered. New hierarchies of approval emerged. Some younger archaeologists viewed this as necessary discipline, a reassertion of order. Others felt it strangled innovation and discouraged partnership. The decision achieved one undeniable result. By the late 1990s, much of the cooperative fieldwork between Ori Associates and state institutions had receded into the gray of unpublished archives. Only fragments survived, references in television transcripts, citations in conference abstracts, and the enduring rumors that the real answers still sleep beneath tourist feet. There is a quiet irony here. Both sides, the empiricists charting geological time and the believers pursuing mythic memory, claimed to protect truth, yet each guarded it from the other, afraid the other's language might dilute its purity. For scientists, belief sounded like contamination. For mystics, data without spirit felt empty. And so the Sphinx, patient witness to human polarity, became the referee neither side acknowledged. Its weathered face looked down on equipment cases and incense smoke alike, both seeking patterns beneath the same sand. Egypt's policymakers disliked the headlines that tied their monuments to Atlantis. For them, heritage was not a playground for lost continents, but proof of early human ingenuity. Yet for American audiences raised on Cayce's prophecies, the same headlines meant proof that the ancients had mastered forgotten sciences. The media fed the contrast, blending speculation with documentary flair. That interplay between mythology and modernity sold well, even when results were inconclusive. The Ars sponsorship thus functioned as both fuel and flare, a steady light by which the world read its own divided imagination. By the turn of the millennium, the academic verdict stood unchanged. No verified man-made chambers exist under the Sphinx, yet the myth refused to decay. In journals of metaphysical studies, each rejection sounded like signposts toward future vindication. Believers saw every bureaucratic seal as proof of hidden discovery. Scholars, fatigued by the subject, turned their gaze elsewhere. But the story lingered, its rhythm matched only by the patient measuring of sandstorms. The data might have hardened into footnotes, but belief continued to drift through air-conditioned lecture halls and candlelit altars alike. Science was measuring stone. Politics was measuring belief. Both metrics proved inexact, shifting with wind and audience mood. In the quiet that follows any dig, when tools are wrapped and footprints fade, a subtler measurement occurs, the distance between evidence and interpretation. That is the void no radar can map. For those who spent years in the desert under Cayce's long shadow, it may have felt like standing on that boundary, part analyst and part believer, unsure which half of themselves the Sphinx was truly watching. Within this ongoing balance, even skeptics admitted a strange convergence. Every survey that disproved a chamber also reinforced the mystery's endurance. Every published no anomaly statement invited another attempt, another funding drive, another psychic echo reinterpreted as scientific clue. The relationship between the R and Egyptology evolved not as a divorce, but as an orbit, each side maintaining distance, yet forever linked by shared gravity around the same enigma in limestone. One sought spiritual confirmation, the other stratigraphic precision. Neither could let go. The boundary had grown blurry long before anyone admitted it. Grant proposals used cautious language, possible anthropogenic cavities, while believers heard Hall of Records between the lines. Film crews documented stone dust patterns, cutting them with voiceovers about lost knowledge. UNESCO reports meant to clarify only widened the interpretive space, and through it all, the Sphinx endured, unmoved by debate, its eyes fixed on horizons where reason and wonder fuse. Across the world stand other watchers, lion-bodied beings guarding temples and gates to forgotten knowledge. Their shadows stretch into the next chapter of this story. Across the world stand other watchers, lion-bodied beings carved with reverent care, frozen at the thresholds of temples like sentinels that have waited longer than memory itself. Their faces differ, some human, some divine, some beastly, but their posture repeats, proud and still, the weight settled through forepaws, the gaze fixed on an invisible horizon. In Mesopotamia, pairs of winged lamassu guarded Assyrian palace gates, colossal and calm beneath arches now collapsed. Thousands of miles east in the temple corridors of southern India, the deity Narasimha, half lion, half man, still bears teeth of both mercy and fury. And beyond oceans in the highlands of Mesoamerica, granite guardians stand half-buried near ruined plazas, their feline mouths curved in the same restrained snarl. The resemblance is not perfect, yet the echo refuses to disappear. Archaeologists categorize these figures as independent archetypes, local myths, solving local anxieties about protection, power, and divinity. Still, the mind tugs toward connection, as if the same blueprint had drifted like smoke across ages and continents. Some whisper that such images might record fragments of an older memory shared before migration scattered our ancestors. Critics counter that the human imagination recycles certain forms because fear and worship look similar everywhere. Still, when the pattern reappears in stone separated by oceans, one feels an old language hiding beneath measurement. A traveler once wrote of recognizing the same eyes across continents, amber, feline, unblinking, in sculptures carved centuries apart. Standing before the Sphinx under the bruised light of dusk, he recalled seeing that same expression in a temple lintel in Nineveh, and again in a jungle ruin where vines crept through cracked basalt. He could not explain why the recognition startled him more than the ruins themselves. The repetition felt deliberate, as though ancient hands had coded emotion into geometry. The elongated muzzle, the squared shoulders, the steady, almost human stillness. Many of these watches point skyward, or rather, they watch along an invisible celestial path. The Great Sphinx aligns near the rising point of the constellation Leo during certain epochs, a detail not easily dismissed as coincidence. Across the ancient world, temples face sacred stars. In Babylonia, the lamassu stood beneath constellations regarded as gates. In the ruins at Angkor, the lion sentinels bracketed stairways that align with solstice dawns. Even in pre-Columbian sites across the Americas, depictions of jaguar gods appear linked with solar cycles, eyes set to the east, awaiting light's first return. Supporters suggest this pattern hints at an architectural conversation across time, each builder hearing a faint instruction that others once obeyed. Some modern architects studying sacred geometry note recurring proportions, sevenths and golden ratios etched from Giza's plateau to Persepolis entrance halls. That might prove nothing more exotic than shared mathematics. Yet to symbolic geographers, those repeating ratios act like a tuning fork, evidence of monuments placed with a knowledge of larger terrestrial harmony. They point out how the Sphinx, the Lamassu, the lion guardians all assume threshold positions, never central within a city. They serve as border forms between sacred and mundane, day and night, living and divine. Perhaps this design instinct reflected how early civilizations perceived thresholds not as walls but as membranes, places where communication, spiritual or otherwise, could occur. Critics dismiss such threads, reminding anyone who will listen that mythic beasts are born from similar psychological clay. A culture experiences danger. It imagines protection. It observes lions, symbols of authority, and remixes them through art. The results resemble one another because the fears resemble one another. It is tidy logic, but too neat for some. Against tidy theories, anomalies lean heavily. Excavators at Anatolian hill sites found half-statues of lions dating millennia before both Egypt's 4th dynasty and Assyria's ascendance. If guardians existed earlier than their known myths, were the later examples attempts at remembrance rather than invention? In temple workshops, artisans chiseled these forms without written blueprints, guided instead by oral pattern and muscle memory. A mason at Nimrud, smoothing the brow ridge of a Lamassu's human face, might never guess that a mason on the Nile worked centuries earlier on a lion's flank almost identical in curve. Yet clay tablets and quarry marks carry similar practical notations, tick marks for symmetry, shallow guidelines forming grids across massive blocks. It could all prove mere coincidence, or evidence of a technical tradition older than writing itself. If so, the Sphinx's builders inherited more than mythology, they inherited design DNA encrypted in the craft. There's a hypothesis favored by a few French historians, that these feline hybrids were not creative flourishes, but identifiers, emblems of a single-source civilization spread thin by catastrophe. They point to flood stories engraved across continents, the same deluge retold in Sumerian, Mayan, and Indian texts. Each myth begins with divine watchers, guardians who ensured knowledge survived exile. The lion, the storm, the gate, these were the emblems of continuity. If any part of that claim drifted through oral lineage, the Sphinx might symbolize not only resurrection but reunion. A memorial carved where survivors landed after the waters fell. Still, evidence bends under scrutiny. The oldest Egyptian texts never name the Sphinx outright. They describe a guardian of the horizon, a being who rises before Ra. That phrase reappears in other places too, guardian of dawn, the watcher at the threshold. The Lamassu's cuneiform inscriptions echo the same wording, he who watches the ways in and out. These linguistic overlaps tantalize philologists, yet words travel easily through trade and conquest, while architecture demands resources and labor. To some linguists, the shared vocabulary might simply reflect a fusion of priestly ideas, not survivors from a single vanished homeland. However one reads it, the image endures. In each version, the creature does not guard gold or weaponry, it guards meaning. A doorway's soul, a temple's breath, a civilization's collective memory. The scene repeats through time. A pilgrim approaches, feels those steady eyes, and hesitates. The stillness beneath that gaze forces reflection, as if the watcher measures the one who dares cross. That ritual pause, repeated across continents, may be the oldest act of reverence humans perform, to acknowledge something larger standing sentinel over the unknown. If one maps these guardians, a curious geography appears. Lines drawn from their coordinates trace broken arcs across continents, Nimrud to Giza, Giza to Angkor, Angkor to Teotihuacan. The pattern bends roughly along Earth's mid-latitude belt, not perfect, yet persistent enough that certain planetary grid theorists, yes, there are such researchers, have labeled these memory sites. Their suggestion is neither mystical nor strictly scientific. They propose that human societies, migrating along favorable climates, chose to rebuild monuments at geomagnetic boundaries they sensed instinctively. Perhaps the symmetry of the lion shape suited the balance they sought between chaos and order. Critics call this geopoetic wishful thinking, yet the maps exist, quietly collecting footnotes beyond mainstream journals. Travelers report a texture common among such sites. The stone carries a sound when struck, a dry resonance that hums faintly under the hand. At Angkor, the sandstone feels porous, almost soft. In Giza, the limestone hums higher, sharper beneath the knuckles. A sculptor recently visiting multiple sites likened it to different notes played from the same instrument. He could not say why humans ages apart chose resonant stones for their lions and guardians, but he sensed intention. Whether ceremonial or acoustic, the material choice suggests shared intuition. That sound, as much as sight, defined sacred boundaries. In astrology, Leo is not just a constellation of stars, but a directional anchor tied to the sun's strength. When the Sphinx gazed toward that cluster around 10,500 BCE, according to some archaeoastronomers, it would have mirrored a sky where the lion rose with dawn at the vernal equinox. If correct, the alignment predates its proposed dynastic age by thousands of years. The same scholars find parallels in temples elsewhere that align with Leo's stars or the solar gates they govern. Mainstream experts counter that such backward projections cherry-pick epochs to produce neat fits. Yet even skeptics admit that ancient builders tracked the skies with precision. The question then becomes, why choose the lion each time the sun's path mattered most? Cultural psychologists offer one explanation. The lion personifies vitality, dominance, and the border between life and death. Across African grasslands where early humans evolved, lions ruled the physical horizon. To conquer fear, humans carved it. But when those same shapes arise in jungles where no lions lived, or in northern lands that never knew them, the explanation falters. Supporters suggest the symbol traveled long after its animal inspiration vanished locally, becoming abstract, a code for strength that no longer required the beast itself. Stone survives better than language, and motifs outlast empires. When Spanish chroniclers described jaguar statues in the New World, the figures were already ancient, their meanings opaque even to the descendants of their sculptors. Yet the pattern endured, forward-facing guardians at thresholds, claws understated but visible, eyes carved to meet the sunrise. It suggests continuity not through dynasty, but through the long memory of form. The repetition becomes a whisper against oblivion. If every generation restores symbols without knowing their origin, they participate in a conversation that began before writing. Perhaps that explains the familiarity travelers feel. The world itself becomes a manuscript copied by countless hands. Each time the civilization at its margin crumbles, the survivors carry fragments of imagery, watchers, lions, gates, and rebuild them wherever they settle. The Sphinx might be only one edition of that manuscript, written larger and on harder stone. Supporters of lost civilization theories see more than coincidence here. They read the guardians as coordinates, markers proving that humanity once grasped a unified model of earth and sky. In this interpretation, every lion carving doubles as a point on a forgotten grid linking power centers of the ancient world, a global architecture of remembrance eroded but traceable. Critics argue the pattern fits simply because the human eye loves to connect dots. Yet the believers persist, their maps dotted with alignments that cross oceans, mountain ranges, and myths. One wonders what the Sphinx looks like from that map's perspective, not just as a monument but as a memory node, anchoring a network that predates formal history. If even a fraction of that network were deliberate, it would suggest communication across distances achieved long before navigational tools or written correspondences. Could myths serve as vessels for navigation? Could a lion's body encode instruction to future generations, hiding in the very posture of stone? Such ideas rest at the fringes of academia, but they keep re-emerging, fueled by new technologies that reveal unexpected geometric symmetries on the planetary scale. Perhaps meaning persists because we still need guardians. Even today, each culture raises its own versions. Stone lions outside libraries, bronze cats before civic buildings, stylized beasts atop corporate headquarters. We claim them as decoration, yet the instinct is the same: protection at entrance, form embodying vigilance. The modern city becomes another temple, and its ornaments remember more than fashion. Somewhere in that repetition hides continuity older than civilization itself. Standing before the Sphinx at dusk, the air cooling after a desert day, one senses the echo of all those other watchers, stone eyes half closed, patient, unblinking. Their message seems less like warning than an invitation, to keep searching for the link between what we carve and what we fear to forget. The Sphinx may not stand alone at all, but as part of a planet-wide chorus of remembrance, each guardian humming its own note into the dark. And back at Giza, perhaps beneath the forepaws where rumors once began, the next verse of that chorus still waits to be translated. If modern instruments already mapped these voids, why do official maps show only solid stone? The question lingers in archaeological circles like heat above the plateau. In Cairo's archives and university basements, shelves carried decades of survey logs, data etched on magnetic tape, notebooks filled in the dry season when the wind carried dust instead of rain. Somewhere among them lie the readings taken around the Sphinx, recordings that once hinted at shapeless pockets beneath its limestone body. Those who worked the instruments remember the echoes returning. They remember marking the depth, the shape, and the coordinates. Yet on every public diagram released since, the bedrock appears seamless, uniform, unbroken. The issue isn't new. Egypt's antiquities law treats anything found within its borders, whether carved in stone or detected by machine, as national heritage property. A seismic reflection curve, though just a line on a chart, qualifies as such. To publish or export that data requires explicit approval from the Supreme Council of Antiquities. During the 1990s, approval rarely came quickly. Bureaucratic caution turned to deliberate slowness once foreign sponsors entered the mix. Some records were simply never cleared at all. Over time, those files were reclassified not as research but as protected archives. And under that label, they could be kept indefinitely from the public eye. Researchers who participated in underground surveys speak carefully about those days. They had arrived under hot sponsorship, half academic, half mystical foundation money, and were watched closely by inspectors. Some recall military guards lingering near the equipment, not threatening, just present. A silence of protocol wrapped the dig site. In official briefings, the conversation shifted from geometry to heritage protection, from numbers to narratives. It is easy to lose information that way, disguised the absence of evidence as cultural respect. One former assistant, working under a joint research permit, now stores old digital backups in a private folder on his home drive. Years ago, he scanned the aging paper records, suspecting they might one day be lost. The files show only fragments, grainy sonographs, labeled by hand. He hasn't published them. He can't. Without clearance, sharing them would mean exile from future projects. Still, on certain evenings, he reopens the folders, running his cursor across lines that seem too precise to be noise. He notes that most of his colleagues have stopped mentioning it altogether. The story froze where the paperwork ended. Meanwhile, technology kept advancing. Moon tomography, cosmic ray imaging capable of seeing through solid rock, mapped voids within the Great Pyramid with stunning accuracy. Those results were made public almost immediately, hailed as proof of scientific transparency. The same instruments could easily scan beneath the Sphinx's base, but permission for such a study never came. No official explanation followed. Only quiet shifts in grammar. Officials spoke of priorities, of ongoing restorations, of limited access windows. Each phrase sounded civil enough but rendered the mystery immobile. Opposite the pyramid's unveiled chambers, the Sphinx remained a closed circuit. Critics of alternative claims often note that secrecy fuels myth even when nothing is hidden. Withholding data, they argue, makes speculation inevitable. If every negative result lay open for inspection, conspiracy would lose oxygen. Instead, the absence becomes part of the design. When no public dataset exists, both believers and skeptics must imagine the missing graphs, the unseen core samples, the out-of-print abstracts that might clarify everything. That vacuum behaves like a magnet, pulls stories toward it simply because it's empty. There's another side, though, the human incentive to guard what gives national pride. Egypt's authorities learned how swiftly a single headline can erode context. Announce an anomaly under the Sphinx, and within hours the phrase mutates into evidence of buried spacecraft, Atlantean archives, or portals guarded by secret orders. Heritage officials know this pattern. They've lived through it before, so they choose silence, reasoning that any information withheld prevents distortion. Yet distortion thrives on silence too, swelling into the very space censorship was meant to protect. Neither path ends cleanly. Some whisper that the unreleased readings were actually dull, minor cracks or subsurface density variations mistaken for chambers. Others suggest that political caution outweighed curiosity, especially when foreign groups used the Sphinx to advance esoteric agendas. Both outlooks hold some truth. A monument revered as global icon cannot easily host experiments that suggest prehistory older than accepted timelines. Such claims dig beyond stone. They dig into identity, admit that the base predates the pharaohs, and whole curricula may require rewriting. That's an excavation far riskier than one done with shovels. If there's irony, it lies in how modern science performs the very act mythology once did. Guarding secrets inside ritual procedure. Permits become incantations. Data servers become prayer rooms where outsiders rarely step. A scientist describing acoustic returned through limestone could sound no less priestly than the ancient astrologer reading the sky. Each translates vibrations into meaning. Each must trust an unseen order behind the numbers. Yet only one is expected to publish his gospel. Skeptics counter that academic caution is not conspiracy. Peer review takes time. Poorly interpreted scans could mislead restorers and cost millions. And indeed, anomalies are not necessarily hollows. Sound may scatter through layers unevenly, producing ghost shapes. Still, others argue that scientific skepticism should lean toward testing, not hiding. Publish everything, they say, even the mistakes. Curiosity thrives on correction. The problem isn't the presence or absence of chambers. It's the refusal to let anyone check. Suppose the voids are nothing, fissures from shifting limestone, or old excavation shafts mistakenly sealed and forgotten. Revealing that would disappoint many, but it would settle the myth on factual ground. Yet officials tread lightly because revelation and ridicule can turn on the same key. What if the spaces prove older than nearby masonry? What if tool marks inside don't match dynastic methods? Even a small deviation might ignite cultural frictions larger than any geological puzzle. The question isn't just scientific, it's political, even existential. Whose story of the past gets to stand untouched? For those still curious, traces of the data surface in oblique ways. Conference papers hint at previous unverified readings. Academic footnotes nod toward companion studies not publicly released. There's a paper trail of acknowledgments to absence, like door frames without doors. Each suggests something glimpsed, recorded, then restricted. It leaves readers half in doubt, half intrigued. Exactly the ecosystem in which alternative theories flourish. Supporters of openness say modern heritage science should match the transparency of medicine or astronomy. After all, cosmic ray imaging inside the Great Pyramid faced less restriction because it carried no association with prophecy or national pride. The Sphinx, being both monument and myth, occupies a different zone where logic and share custody. Access implies power. Whoever interprets the subsurface first shapes the public imagination. And perhaps that's what the permits are really protecting. Not secrets in stone, but narrative control. A former survey engineer explained that the thin line between academic and spiritual curiosity made regulators suspicious. Funding from mystical foundations felt like a cultural intrusion, reminiscent of colonial collecting days. If the state allowed those sponsors to claim discovery of ancient records, Egypt risked watching its heritage rebranded as Atlantis mythology overnight. To avoid that, authorities preferred stalemate to scandal. An unsolved question caused less damage than a controversial answer. Elsewhere in the world, similar tensions play out quietly. In Mexico, LiDAR scans of Mayan ruins sometimes vanish into locked archives until site protection measures can adapt. In India, satellite data over prehistoric shell mounds remain embargoed while heritage mapping policies catch up. Beneath each case lies the same unease: how to release information without letting outsiders reshape its meaning. Egypt, being both cradle and showcase of antiquity, bears this burden most visibly. Still, a paradox hums beneath it all. By controlling access, institutions safeguard the tangible heritage, yet they also preserve an intangible one, the collective dream that something marvelous still sleeps below. The Sphinx's mystery survives not because technology fails, but because permission hesitates. In that vacuum, every scan, rumor, and travelogue merges into a modern mythology, with bureaucrats as reluctant storytellers. Even the file cabinets, locked and labeled, become part of the monument's aura. For the people closest to the secret, surveyors, archivists, restorers, the burden turns personal. One speaks of watching sunlit tourists at the plateau while knowing measurements buried deep in storage might outlive him. He describes the quiet habit of looking at the monument from its east side, where the bedrock slopes into shadow, wondering what his instruments had almost reached before the plug was pulled. He never received another permit. Sometimes he teaches field methods to students, showing them how to calibrate equipment, how to listen for false echoes, but never telling them what he once heard. Supporters suspect the withheld readings indicate a structure. Others insist the voids are merely unexcavated drainage channels. The argument often misses a quieter point. Secrets once named shape history as powerfully as discoveries. Call something forbidden data and it transforms from record to relic. The more officials deny access, the more symbolic weight the anomaly gains. That symbolic pressure now outweighs any technical uncertainty. No dataset could satisfy curiosity that grand. The Sphinx, therefore, continues to embody both absence and promise. Technology advanced past superstition, yet the monument resists exposure, not through any mystical force, but through the simplest of human instincts: control, pride, caution, fear of ridicule. Beneath those motives, something subtler moves, the knowledge that demystifying it might quiet the myth forever, and silence, once broken, can never be remade. The truth, perhaps, is less dramatic. The voids might be air pockets in stone, their shapes confused by layers of fracture. Or they might be remnants of older constructions sealed during the earliest temple restorations. But as long as official channels remain closed, we navigate on rumor, balancing facts like stones along a buried path. Instruments can pierce the ground. Permission decides what surfaces. So the maps stay clean, the documents locked, the debates unresolved. Permission shapes reality, not geology. The absence of evidence becomes the stage on which belief performs, and from that performance grows a strange equilibrium. Skepticism keeping faith alive, faith keeping inquiry awake. Both sides guard the Sphinx now, scientists around their archives, dreamers around their prophecies. In this standoff, suppression sustains the same discovery once promised. The monument's legend feeds on the space between known and forbidden, a gap no satellite can close. What lies beneath may one day be scanned to exhaustion, revealing either chambers or nothing at all. Yet long before that happens, the greater story continues to unfold above the sand. How the guardians of knowledge decide what we're allowed to call real, and how the rest of us, watching from afar, keep listening to the quiet underneath, hoping the ground might one day speak. What if it did? What if the files finally opened, the anomalies confirmed or denied? How would that reshape the stories we tell about ourselves, our origins, our ingenuity, our hunger to touch the past? The Sphinx waits unchanged, as though it already knows the answer, staring east into sunlight that outlasts every permission slip, every secret still sealed in stone. And somewhere in a quiet archive, the pulse of unshared data continues to hum, steady, patient, unread. Some claim the voids hold relics of a civilization erased by flood. Others think they hold nothing but air and unanswered prayers. The Sphinx has heard both versions for longer than language has existed, the wind carrying their weight through fissures in the limestone. Under its vast gaze, theories drift like grains of sand. Many settle, some vanish, but a few keep circling back as if drawn by something magnetic embedded in the bedrock. The truth we keep chasing might be less physical than emotional, yet the pull feels the same. The desert, as always, knows how to hold its silence until we ask the right question. Across decades of whispered conjecture, the spectrum of belief stretches wide. At one end are those who see a library sealed by a vanished race, a memory bank from a time when the stars supposedly guided cities and the earth knew a gentler gravity. They speak of crystalline drives, metallic codices, and machinery sleeping beneath millennia of pressure. At the other end stand geologists who shrug and call it cast, natural fissures widened by ancient groundwater and later buried by shifting dunes. Between those poles lie endless shades of maybe formed by rumor, misread data, and the lingering desire that something hidden might validate every myth we ever told ourselves. Supporters suggest that under the Sphinx lies testimony from a world blanketed by flood, a civilization that glimpsed extinction and tried to pass on instructions for rebuilding. Others dismiss such talk as the human reflex to fill any void with meaning. Still, the debate endures because no one is truly certain what the instruments found, and few agree on who should be allowed to look again. Without access, absence turns into evidence of its own kind. What we can't measure, we invent. Each new theory doesn't replace the old, it layers over it, like bands of sediment building a new landscape of half-remembered possibility. The question that surfaces most often is no longer, what's there, but why can't we let it go? It's strange how the idea of a buried vault haunts not through proof, but through refusal. Refusal of time to seal itself. Refusal of humans to accept that some doors might open only inward. A camera probe, a ground-penetrating signal. Each technological advance is greeted not with closure, but with renewed ambiguity. The data hums, the instruments blink, and we project whole civilizations into pixels that never form a clear image. The missing piece becomes the story, not the silence around it. Workers who have brushed sand from its flanks say the Sphinx's expression shifts with the light. At dawn it is soft, at noon severe, and by twilight unreadable. The same happens with our perceptions. An archaeologist may see simple erosion, while a mystic sees warning carved in stone. A tourist kneels to take a photograph, unaware that their boot rests above a coordinate Cayce once spoke of a century before. Small coincidences accumulate like buried markers, suggesting patterns only when viewed from distance. The mind links them because the heart wants a reason to believe human history is deeper than old bones and broken pottery. Among Egyptian workers on the plateau, night shifts carry their own tone. When the crowd disperses and the air cools, they tell stories under low light. Some describe hearing faint hollows when tapping with chisels during restoration, as if pockets unused to air briefly sighed beneath the surface. They don't call it proof, just an odd sound that lingers. Others nod and recount that their fathers heard the same. Oral memory stitches through generations more reliably than paperwork, keeping alive a rumor even officials don't entirely deny. Every myth needs such caretakers, voices that keep it from fading completely into the academic archives. For a few researchers, unverified data becomes personal history. One geophysicist once described, after retiring, how he dreamt nightly of descending a narrow shaft lined with damp limestone, the smell sharp as rust. He never claimed it was real, just the subconscious playing back his years of measuring echoes underground. Yet those dreams reveal how much human effort attaches to mystery. Hours spent calibrating sensors, marking cross-sections, writing reports destined for storage. They all express a need to transform speculation into contact. When physical doors won't open, the imagination keeps tunneling. Myths, after all, are not lies. They are mirrors held at different angles across centuries. The Sphinx's imagined vault serves as one of those mirrors, reflecting each culture's own anxiety about origin and loss. When Europe first rediscovered Egypt, explorers dreamed of Atlantean architects whose knowledge might redeem industrial civilization. Later, Cold War scientists saw in it a metaphor for suppressed information, secrets withheld by authorities. In recent years, digital age thinkers view it as an encryption challenge, the Earth itself protecting its data with geological passwords. Each era finds itself inside the riddle, seeing what it needs to recover. There's something almost tender about that repetition. The same desert, the same forepaws, the same speculation reshaped by new context. If the Sphinx could speak, perhaps it would tell us that curiosity is the constant, not the architecture. Scholars record, mystics interpret, storytellers translate the gaps. The monument simply endures their projections. What it shelters, whether stone voids, archives, or nothing at all, matters less than how it organizes our longing. To look beneath the Sphinx is to look beneath the skin of civilization itself, to ask whether memory can outlast its makers. One archaeologist once compared digging in Egypt to listening for the faintest breath beneath noise. He said you never stop hearing the past whispering under the static of sand. That quiet persistence mirrors the way myths survive criticism. Every attempt to silence them becomes a form of attention. Bureaucratic secrecy, academic scorn, spiritual insistence, all of it feeds the very legend it tries to contain. When official responses deny the existence of chambers, forums light up. When no one speaks, the rumor grows louder. Information loops into faith. Faith mutates into folklore, and the cycle starts anew. At a deeper level, the Sphinx's mystery outlives verification because it satisfies a primal need: continuity. We want to believe that knowledge never truly disappears, that someone, somewhere, had the foresight to store it against oblivion. Flood myths, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, promise that what is lost may still return. So when the desert erases detail, humanity imagines an archive hidden inside the erasure. We search for ourselves under the lion's shadow, hoping that the message reads that our beginnings were deliberate, not accidental. In that sense, the Hall of Records exists already as metaphor made manifest. Think of every explorer who stood at its base, eyes narrowed against the glare. What they felt was not ownership of discovery, but exposure to enormity. The plateau's stillness exaggerates time itself. Even the breeze carries millennia of dust. In such magnitude, myths feel plausible. Perhaps that is why we keep revisiting them. They operate like night lights against the immensity of history's dark. Small, glowing assurances that someone before us cared enough to leave instructions. Whether factual or imagined, those instructions shape our confidence and continuity. There's another layer hidden not under the stone, but within collective thought. Each new generation leaves its own inscriptions, not on tablets, but in databases, documentaries, satellite scans. These become tomorrow's archaeology. A future scholar, centuries from now, may unearth our obsession with what might lie beneath Giza and see it as evidence of our struggle to define truth. What we call speculation, they may label scripture. What we dismiss as fantasy could survive as coherence. Once enough distance softens skepticism, the myth's endurance guarantees its renewal. The more the story is retold, the more it merges with identity. Egyptian guides balance pride with caution. Knowing tales of great antiquity draw visitors yet risk dispute. Western seekers layer mysticism over geology. Local elders invoke protection of ancestral spirits. The Sphinx absorbs all perspectives without contradiction. In this way, it functions less as monument and more as canvas, a surface on which divergent histories write themselves simultaneously. Its power stems from ambiguity, from the refusal to settle into one narrative long enough to lose possibility. Some whisper that the chambers may already have been entered long ago, quietly and without record. A sealed hole here, a filled trench there. The marks of old repairs stir suspicion. Others counter it's just conservation work, nothing more. But unresolved rumor acts like a lodestone. New visitors arrive looking for the faint unevenness in the stone that could mark a doorway. Children of dig workers press ears to the base for the hollow sound. Even if no portal opens, the act of listing itself sustains belief. Mystery doesn't require fulfillment. It feeds on the expectation that it might one day make sense. Occasionally, the human yearning becomes visible in stranger ways. Artists sculpt miniature sphinxes with transparent cores, installing tiny LEDs where the heart should be. Writers weave entire chronicles about civilization stored inside crystalline rooms beneath the plateau. These inventions echo the emotional logic that built the original monument, to endure beyond limitation. The creative impulse mirrors the geological one, compression over time forming something solid out of pressure and fragments. Every new retelling becomes another sediment layer surrounding the original myth, making it heavier, more complex, harder to excavate without altering it. Whether cosmic library or hollow chamber, the endurance of this myth has already changed how scholars approach prehistory. It pressured geology to refine its dating of rainfall eras, inspired new scanning methods, and forced institutions to confront the politics of secrecy. Even skepticism evolved. Scientists now phrase denial more carefully, aware that outright dismissal only ignites interest. Thus, paradoxically, a story possibly born from trance visions and rumor has reshaped research behavior. The Hall of Records might never be found, but it has already written itself into the methodology of modern inquiry. Every anomaly withheld from public view feeds another storyteller. Each withheld report becomes an unwritten invitation. The more unverified, the more alive the legend. In this way, the myth and the secrecy become a single organism, each sustaining the other's breath. If tomorrow someone revealed the voids to be nothing but uneven density in the limestone, the relief would quickly turn to nostalgia. What would we chase then? Certainty satisfies the mind but starves the imagination. The definitive answer might be, paradoxically, the final burial of everything that kept the mystery living. Through it all, the Sphinx stares east toward the rising sun as though forever watching for the world that once was. Archaeologists measure its dimensions, mystics read its posture, poets interpret its stillness. But beneath all interpretations lies the same reflection, the one we cast upon it. We search for our missing chapters inside its weathered body, because deep down we suspect those chapters describe us. The true hall of records may not rest under rock, but within the persistence of asking, within each generation's refusal to let the past close like a sealed door. Perhaps that is what the Sphinx guards, the ongoing act of seeking. Its paws press against the desert not as locks but as anchors, holding steady the terrain of wonder. It gives form to the human echo that refuses to fade, the need to locate meaning beneath the surface. What lies below may be nothing more than stone, or air, or the faint reverberation of our own questions. Yet the effort to uncover it keeps us tethered to history's pulse. The Sphinx becomes the listener and we the sound. And so the monument endures, unmoved by hypothesis or rebuttal. Its secret may not be a structure waiting to be opened, but a mirror polished by centuries of curiosity, reflecting each new generation's search for itself. In that reflection, the void no longer appears empty. It glows faintly, filled with memory, intention, and the quiet promise that the story is still unfolding. The sands do not speak, yet across millennia they hold their pose, soft against the paws of the Sphinx, unbroken through conquest, weather, and excavation. Beneath that immense stillness lies more than geology or craftsmanship. It holds a question about memory itself, whether humanity has forgotten its own beginning, and built this riddle in stone as a mirror to recall it. The Sphinx seems less like a monument, and more like a pause carved into the desert, a breath caught between creation and recognition. Each grain of sand that drifts across its face feels like a syllable in a sentence no one can fully read. Standing before it, you understand how easily curiosity turns into reverence. The monument stares east, not toward a god, but toward recurrence, the renewal of dawn. Some whisper that this gaze is more than symbolic, that it aligns history like a calendar of stone, and that under its forepaws lies the record of a time before recorded speech. Whether it guards air, water channels, or relics of a civilization the sea erased, the Sphinx does what all guardians do. It waits until humanity is ready to ask correctly. The waiting itself becomes its message. Truth has never been steady here. Every attempt to define the Sphinx has produced a contradiction. Sacred guardian, weathered idol, relic of lost science, architectural accident. Over centuries, priests, emperors, surveyors, and scientists have each found their reflection in its face. Perhaps that is what it was meant to hold, a catalog not of ancient tools, but of human interpretation. Its power may come from this uncertainty, the way it invites imagination to occupy the gaps archaeology leaves. Some researchers say the most enduring mysteries are built not to deceive, but to preserve the act of wondering. If the buried voids ever open, what story would they tell? Supporters suggest a codex of forgotten technology or maps to an earlier Earth. Skeptics see the echo of erosion, nothing more. Yet both sides circle the same realization. Seeking the answer has already altered our view of human origins. The hypothesis, the tests, the disputes, all of it now belongs to the Sphinx's narrative as much as the limestone itself. To stand before it is to sense that discovery may not be the goal, but the ritual. Verification would end the dreaming. Uncertainty allows the mind to travel. Night settles over Giza, and the air cools until the desert seems to exhale. The Sphinx, half in shadow, still watches the horizon that first inspired its builders. A traveler might hear the wind brushing through fissures at its base like breath through an ancient instrument. Those faint tones may be nothing but air against porosity, or a language humanity has not yet learned to translate. The truth, perhaps, is that the monument guards not a chamber, but the impulse to keep listening. Somewhere beneath the weight of ages, the desert keeps whispering its unfinished sentence to anyone who pauses long enough to hear it. Thank you so much for watching. See y'all in the next one video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.